From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus with Paul Salem.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. This week we're going to be looking at the developing situation in Turkey and Turkish-American relations and the Turkish involvement in northern Syria. President Erdogan, a few days ago, in a surprising and very important move, called for snap elections in Turkey, both presidential and parliamentary. That was not expected. There's also been the trial or showing up in trial of Pastor Andrew Bronson, an American missionary who's being held in Turkey and the repercussions of that, and the developing situation in northern Syria where U.S. forces and Turkish forces are not too far apart. With me to discuss these issues are Dr. Gonul, director of our Turkey program here at the Middle East Institute. Gonul, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Paul.
And our good friend, Ambassador Robert Pearson, a senior non-resident senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, former U.S. ambassador to Turkey, currently ambassador to North Carolina, as I understand it, living there. Robert, thanks for joining us.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
Gonul, let's start with snap elections. That's a very big move. What's behind it? What's the President Erdogan thinking?
Well, actually, many of us were expecting early elections, so there is no surprise there, but we were not expecting them to be held this early. So June is right around the corner, June 24th. And I think several factors that influence his thinking. The first one is I think he really wants to capitalize on the relative success of Turkey's military incursion into the Syrian town of Afrin. And that's number one, because according to public opinion polls, he gathered more. There's more support now.
And
for
since
Erdogan.
you mentioned that, where are his numbers at roughly today, popularity-wise?
Well, obviously there are just so many different opinion polls, but I've never seen one that is, he's in alliance with this ultra-nationalist party, MHP. So combined, they have to capture 50% to win. And I've seen very few public opinion polls that suggest they will get that.
For parliament,
for presidential elections.
For presidential.
Yes,
Yeah.
so it's very critical. So the public opinion surveys are not very bright for Erdogan.
Let me pause right there
Sure.
to understand it better on the presidential election. If he doesn't get 50% plus one, it goes into a runoff.
Yes.
And wouldn't he be likely to win that runoff? I mean, he'll either win in the first round or the second round? Or are you saying, is there doubt that he could even win a presidential election?
Well, if you assume that the elections would be free and fair,
Well, I'm assuming they are what they are. No, I'm not assuming they're free and fair.
I think he's lost a lot of ground. So if he cannot capture 50% one in the first round, in the second round, I think it's going to be very risky because the opposition, which is very divided, and of course it's in Erdogan's favor, they can actually unite and could a real pose a real challenge to Erdogan. So that's why he will do everything in his power to win in the first round.
Well, a quick snapshot of the parliamentary elections. How will the AKP fare according to projections?
Well, again, according to public opinion surveys, Erdogan still has the backing of around 40%. And the pro-Kurdish HDP support waivers around 9 and 10%. So if they cannot pass the 10% electoral threshold, it's going to be in the AKP's favor. And you have the MHP, the ultra-nationalists. I think there are many public opinion polls suggesting that they will not be able to pass the 10% threshold, so it will be left out. And you have the CHP, so its traditional support base is somewhere between 20 to 27, 28%.
Thanks, Gonul. Robert, let me turn to you. You, like Gonul, have been following Turkey for a very long time. Where would you describe President Erdogan and the AKP in their current evolution? I mean, when they first came on the scene, Islamist movement, and then they turned more to sort of a movement of reform and economic development, applying to the EU. Then they turned more sort of Islamists, and then Erdogan got into all kinds of domestic trouble with the Gulen and so on. Where are we now, do you think, in the evolution of this leader and his party?
I was there. Thank you. I was there when The AKP had a very liberal campaign platform, and they really had a huge tent, liberals to religious conservatives, and they won a smashing majority. I think really as a reflection of the failure of all the traditional parties to actually run the country well. So they had a lot of support that lasted for a long time. They carried out an economic miracle the first few years. And then difficulties, I think, encouraged in part by conservative backlash, trying to tailor Erdogan's ambitions, moved him steadily to the right and to more conservative positions. And now he really exercises de facto almost unlimited power in Turkey. The last major independent newspaper is about to be sold to an ardent supporter of President Erdogan. So it looks as if in the run-up to the elections that Gonul has been talking about, he is putting himself in as strong a position as he possibly can to get over the top.
Well, let me ask you a question. So Erdogan has effectively closed down political space, independent media, very authoritarian. Thousands of people in jail. Now, part of that was related to the coup, but he took advantage of that maybe to clean house. And yet, as Gonul is saying, he's kind of struggling maybe to win an election. Are we missing something here? I mean, is Turkey still a democracy in the sense that he can be brought down in an election, or are we missing something?
I think the election will be free enough that if the Turkish people turn out with a clear majority for a candidate other than Erdogan, it'll be recognized. But I also think that while this referendum that was held in 2017 about a new constitution had as its basis was there a theoretical reason to worry about Erdogan's power. Now, with thousands of people having been purged, people have a realistic idea about what it means. This is the 7th time that Mr. Erdogan has extended the emergency decree, for example. Mm-hmm. People are still in jail. And now the war is beginning to wear away at people, too. So they're worried about where Turkey is going with the war in Syria. So we have the economic fragility of Turkey becoming more visible now. The lira has been losing strength. Hyperinflation economic policies put in place to try to shore up public support. So there are some significant factors that could break one way or the other that could give him some sleepless nights.
Interesting. Gonul, your thoughts on that? I mean, you write a lot about it. So.
Well, I think this is what people feel in Turkey. Many in the opposition think that this is the last exit. So this is their last opportunity to make a change. And I believe that authoritarian leaders, they still need elections. There were elections held in Egypt, in Russia, so you still need that certain level of legitimacy. But I believe that Erdogan has been laying the groundwork for that. He passed laws that allow civil servants to monitor the elections, and stamped votes can be counted as valid, and ballot boxes can be moved around. So I think it means that he's bent on winning by every means. So I think that is critical. And at the end of the day, these elections are way too important for him to leave it to chance. So he will rig elections. But many people argue that, yes, he can rig, but still there are institutions and there's a limit to what he can do. So if the margin is around 4 or 5%, maybe he can, but other than that, it's going to be very difficult. And I'm in the opinion that I'm not that hopeful. I think he will rig the elections.
So in a way, what Robert also said, that if there's a huge majority against him, it's hard to rig that. But if it's close, and you're basically saying it's probably going to be close, the referendum was close, opinion polls are close, he can manage that, is kind of what you're saying. Well, thank you for that. Robert, let me turn back to you and explain sort of to our listeners, maybe it's not easily explainable, but the U.S. relationship with Turkey today, traditionally it was a NATO ally, a bulwark against the Soviet Union. We live in a different world now. Before getting into the nitty-gritty of what's happening in Syria or this pastor Andrew Bronson, how do U.S. policymakers look at Turkey today in 2018? Is it a friend? Is it an ally? Is it an adversary? What framework should we use?
Well, I think to some extent, American analysts now are all over the map about Turkey, and the base of support for Turkey, which lasted for decades, has been severely eroded in the last few years. I think that despite that, there's a lot of hope in the United States, broadly speaking, for a renewal of a good relationship. And there are a lot of people who are trying to find ways to do that and coming up with creative ideas. And I think that assuming that Mr. Pompeo is approved as Secretary of State, he'll be given an opportunity to pick up this issue because it has to be one of the major issues for a new secretary. And maybe we'll have to wait till after the election to know whether that's possible or not, but it will be high on his agenda. There'll be a lot of support for trying to find a way to move ahead.
Well, let's talk. Go ahead.
No,
go ahead.
if I may, I think there's also a lot of confusion
You
in
may,
Washington.
by the way. You may.
Thank you for that. Well, I think there's a lot of confusion about many other things, but about Turkey too among policymakers. I mean, even within the Pentagon. You have the Central Command that's been working with the Syrian Kurdish fighters, and they think that they are too valuable, and Turkey is already lost. On the other hand, you have the EUCOM, who are saying that Turkey is still a valuable NATO ally, so we cannot just lose Turkey. And around Trump, there are people who are suggesting that it's important to engage Turkey, and there are those who are saying that, well, Turkey has been working at cross purposes and undermining our interest in the region. So I think there's a lot of confusion about what to do.
Let's unpack that a bit, because that's, at the end of the day, policy is persons. I mean, particularly in this administration. The first national security advisor, Michael Flynn, worked for Turkey just before.
Quite
being
literally,
appointed.
yes.
Literally. Trump tweeted about Turkey recently. So my question is, Gonul, you've talked about the Pentagon, and even in the Pentagon, there are different views. Do you have any thoughts about where the persons, Donald Trump, Mike Pompeo, John Bolton, now Secretary Mattis, Secretary of Defense, you've sort of maybe mentioned, but if we haven't mentioned him by name, on the American side, those players, what do you know about their attitudes towards Turkey?
I think that there's an interesting foundation here. When Secretary Tillerson went to Turkey and had discussions that appeared to be the beginning of an opening for a real discussion, he had the full support of Secretary Mattis. He had the full support of some of the advisors, I'll say, in the White House. And so actually there was a kind of underlying consensus. I don't know how broad it was. So Mike Pompeo, John Bolton, President Trump can pick up on that if they want to. I think the Turks have left the door open to do that. They will be wary in Ankara of Pompeo. They will be wary of John Bolton. There's absolutely no doubt about it. But that doesn't mean the door is closed about getting a discussion started.
And Gonul, your thoughts on that and on attitudes on the Turkish side? I mean, the president obviously is maybe the hegemonic player in Turkey, but are there any other views? I mean, in Turkey, America bashing is quite
very popular,
but it is also equally popular, interesting enough, in Egypt, and yet Egypt is very close to the U.S. as a government. What are the attitudes in Ankara? What are the nuances there?
Well, I think Pompeo, I mean, he tweeted some unpleasant tweets. Basically, he didn't have a lot of respect for President Erdogan. And right after he was named the next Secretary of State, pro-government media covered that a lot. But I think it will all depend on what he wants to do in Syria, what he wants to do with the YPG, because other contentious issues on the agenda in bilateral relations, there are not much that either Secretary of State or even the President can do. Such as extradition of Fethullah Gülen. So I think it will be about that. And we don't know what Pompeo is planning to do in terms of U.S. presence in Syria. And also Iran is very important. If Pompeo reinforces Trump's very hawkish Iran instincts, that's not good news for Turkey.
Why?
Well, because Turkey has always traditionally supported engaging. It's always been against Iran sanctions because it's a close trade partner. It can't really afford sanctions. So that's why in 2010, for instance, voted against the sanctions at the United Nations, and that really angered Americans. So that is another potential problem. And if you look at the views from Ankara, I think they are, again, the YPG is the key, but I think there's there's a consensus there. Traditionally, in Turkey, the Turkish military and center-right parties promoted closer ties with the U.S. And you don't see those constituencies are not there anymore. The military is not as pro-NATO as it used to be. And obviously, the Turkish government is really capitalizing on the anti-American mood. So there's very little appetite to have that, at least in narrative. But at the end of the day, I don't think that Turkey still values its NATO membership and partnership with the U.S. Can't break it. But you'll see more hawkish narrative rhetoric.
Well, Robert, into all of this brew came the issue of this pastor, Andrew Bronson.
Right.
Tell us a bit about that, and how important is it? The President Trump tweeted about it, so is it getting...
It's getting widespread publicity in the United States now. A year or so ago, Andrew Brunson was picked up and charged with conspiring with the Gulenist organization to aid the coup attempt in July of 2016. He had been a resident of Izmir for about 20 years. His wife was there. I think they had a small church, but essentially he was a member of the community and had done nothing that would attract attention. A lot of people think that he is simply a hostage in the game of trying to compel from the United States the extradition of Minister Gulen. And the Turks did the same sort of thing with German journalists and other journalists until that kind of controversy was tamped down. The interesting thing about this incident is that he appeared in court the week before the Hawk Bank defendant in New York, Mehmet Atilla,
another thread,
exactly, was about to be sentenced. And when the issue of Reza Zarrab was still in the public eye, and he was allegedly directly connected with corruption in the Erdogan regime. So it looked a little too obvious in a way that he appears in court just before these other incidents take place. So we'll have to see what happens. There are a good number of American senators who've written President Erdogan to ask him to release this guy. I think this tactic is backfiring on Turkey a little bit.
In the time we have left, I want to pivot to Syria, the situation post the Turkish Operation Afrin, which was pretty rapidly a success in terms of Turkey's success there. The Americans are still in northeastern Syria, although the president says the U.S. is leaving and others that we're not. We're still there, at least for the time being. And the town of Manbij has become a point of contention. So Gonul, explain what the situation is. Where is it heading?
Well, after Turkey launched the military incursion into Afrin, President Erdogan threatened that the next target would be Manbij. And of course, Manbij is quite critical. There are around 2,000 U.S. special forces there. And they had, after Tillerson, Rex Tillerson...
The 2,000 forces are in Manbij or in the whole Northeast?
In the whole Northeast. But the Manbij is many saw that as a breaking point. Because, of course, if Erdogan followed through, it would mean a possibility of a clash between the two NATO allies. So the American officials tried very hard to prevent that from happening. And Rex Tillerson was in Turkey, held meetings with his Turkish counterpart. And after the meeting, I think the two painted different pictures. Turkish foreign minister was confident that he actually said that the Americans had promised them that the Syrian Kurdish forces would withdraw from Manbij. And Secretary Tillerson was vague about it. And the problem there is Secretary is out, Tillerson is out, and we don't know what actually were discussed because there was no American officials other than Tillerson attending the meeting. So we don't know what happened there. And now the Turks are saying that the discussions have stalled because there's a new secretary. And so I assume they will keep talking about it, but I don't think there are that many options.
Robert, do you see a serious risk of a Turkish-American clash in Syria, or is it...
I don't, not before the election, which would be a real roll of the dice, and not before Pompeo is in office and has a chance to come to Turkey and talk to him. I think that the way the Turks, to put it nicely, tried to capture what they thought Tillerson wanted to say means that they would like to have a deal with the Americans. And the Americans did say at one point that they would not stay west of the Euphrates. And so I think that Tillerson must have said something to them that made them think that they could negotiate. So a lot of ifs in all of this. So we'll have to see what Pompeo comes up with. And in the meantime, it would be extremely important, at least from an American standpoint, that Turkey not do anything that would create new tensions along the border.
And also a clash in Manbij is less likely, especially after what the Russians did and said. So after the chemical weapons attacks, Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov asked Turkey to leave Afrin. Of course, that's very unnerving for Ankara. So that means that actually that
They don't have that Russian support.
They don't have the Russian support, which makes them vulnerable. So I think that's why negotiations and the common understanding, reaching a common understanding with the Americans might be more appealing now.
Well, thank you for that. That's all the time we have, but we've covered a lot of ground in 20 minutes. And we will keep our eye on these upcoming events of the elections in Turkey, as well as the confirmation of Mike Pompeo and whether he goes soon to Ankara to work out some of these details. I want to thank my two guests. Robert, thanks for being with us today. And Gonul, thank you as always for joining us. And thank you, our listeners, for tuning in. And we will see you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.